Subway driver's horror. I've been riding the subway and the commuter rail trains in Massachusetts for 30 years. Been on about 5 trains that have hit people. Seen a crazy woman chasing an innocent female passenger and to go on to kick the crap out of a male subway inspector who intervened. One of my favorites was the guy who fell asleep standing up, leaning forward against the doors. The train stopped, doors opened, and he just slowly fell forward like a tree falling in the woods. Never put his hands down. Slap, right onto the platform. Turned over like, hey, who woke me up and how did it get down here, expression on his face.
Riding the subway for that long must have given you some wild stories. It's interesting how people react in those situations. That guy falling asleep and landing like that sounds funny. Public transport definitely has its share of unexpected moments and characters. It's kind of surprising how some things unfold when you least expect them.
Not subway but London's Docklands Light Railway. They used to have a shutdown every August bank holiday. It gave 3 clear days where major works and repairs could be undertaken from the Saturday morning through to the Tuesday morning. We were putting new equipment trackside and on the Saturday morning we were walking along the track measuring distances etc. Ready to do the install of equipment on the Sunday and Monday. As we were walking we noticed a woman laid across the tracks with her head on one rail and her feet on the other. Of note is that the DLR has a 500V DC third rail, which of course was off due to the shutdown. Also the trains are automatic and have no driver. Most of the time, we walked towards the woman, who had seen us but didn't do anything. When we were close we asked her what she was doing and told her she couldn't be here, it's illegal to trespass on the railway in the UK. They turned her head and said, I've had enough, next train coming is going to end it for me. I said, well you're going to have to wait until Tuesday love, there's no trains this weekend. She got up and stormed off complaining about bloody trains.
That's quite a situation. It's wild how people can find themselves in such dark places. Good thing there were no trains running, though. It sounds like a confusing moment for everyone involved. At least you were able to get through to her, and maybe give her a second thought. Hopefully, she finds some help and has better days ahead. Just another day working on the railway, I guess.
My wife has interesting stories from her time commuting on the trains in Tokyo. One time she fell asleep on the train after a long day at work and was about to miss her stop, but some random stranger tapped her on her shoulder and said, hey miss, wake up at your station. She was half asleep and already off the train when she realized how stalkerish that was. Another time some teenage girl started to pluck hair strands from my wife's hair, and when my wife confronted her about it, the girl simply replied, okay, if you don't like it then I'll stop. No apology or anything.
That's a couple of wild stories. The first one is pretty surprising, but it's nice that someone looked out for her. The second one is just strange, you don't see that every day. It's odd how some people act, especially on public transport. Makes you wonder what goes through their minds.
Not a driver, but a memorable time I had with the trains was as a pedestrian. This was 95 NYC and I was living there. I went to visit a friend on Tiemann Place for lunch, great roti shop there at the time. The train, January 9th, was halfway stopped at the station. The 125th stop on Broadway is an elevated track at that point. A homeless woman had jumped on the tracks and was crushed. This had just happened as we were walking, and chunks of her were falling to the street. She was dripping. It was disturbing and yet, so, normal. We went for lunch, came out and the emergency personnel were hosing down the tracks. Train service was up and running. And, whoever she was gone. Her death was made no more memorable than her life was to her. Certainly left no lasting impression on the greatest city in the world.
That sounds really intense. It's strange how life just goes on, even after something so shocking happens. People are often desensitized to harsh realities, especially in a city like NYC. You must have had mixed feelings about that day. The way you describe the whole situation reflects how some moments can feel heavy yet ordinary at the same time. Not sure how I'd react to seeing something like that.
This happened years ago on the Orange Line from Boston to Medford. I was in a crowded car heading home from work and kept feeling something on my upper right leg. It was crowded to the point that it was standing room only, so I didn't think much of it, just figured it was someone's briefcase or something. Well, it happened again and I looked down to see this middle-aged woman in a brown trench coat arching her hips forward and purposefully bumping her box off my leg. I turned into water and found the path of least resistance the hell away from her.
This sounds pretty uncomfortable. Being in a crowded space can lead to some awkward situations. That woman's actions were pretty invasive. It's good you got away from it. People should be more aware of personal space, especially in tight environments like that.
I was coming home with my girlfriend on a late Friday night on a 1/9 train, ancient carriages, even down to old wooden benches. We were likely the only sober passengers, and one wandered off at the wrong stop. He figured it out as the doors started to close and stretched his arm out to stop the doors closing. But the doors just closed on his wrist and the train started moving, pulling him along. I'm sure stopping there would have made for a more interesting story than what actually happened. Dude ran along with the train for about 15 feet, I jumped up and pulled the emergency stop cord. Train stopped, doors opened, guy walked back to his seat. 10 minutes later conductor comes to our car with a cop, resets the emergency stop, and angrily asks who pulled the cord. I stand up, also, all the drunk assholes, except the now passed out near victim, pointed at me, and explain what happened. Conductor spends a minute or two berating me for lying to him, because what I describe is physically impossible, and probably would have meant a lot of paperwork. I stand silently while cop notices I'm actually sober and just pretends not to hear the rest of the conductor's diatribe. 5 minutes later we're on our way.
That sounds like a pretty wild ride home. It's interesting how things can take a turn like that. The conductor's reaction is kind of typical, you know? They probably see a lot of nonsense. Funny that the drunk passengers didn't back you up. But at least the guy got back to his seat without much trouble. Just a normal night can become a bit of a story. Glad you all made it home safe.
Not a driver but a commuter. I used to live in Toronto, so I've seen my fair share of WTF moments, but one sticks out by a long shot. I had just finished work and was taking the TTC subway from Keele Station to College Station, close to where I lived. This was in the middle of rush hour, keep in mind. So the subway cars are packed like sardines. I enter a subway car and the first thing I notice is that I'm overwhelmed by the intense smell of shit. Imagine if someone had poured liquid diarrhea up your nose. It was everywhere and I immediately started gagging. Some asshat had smeared shit in this corner of the subway car and it was marinating like a gargabe on a hot summer day. Everyone smelt it. You could see it on the chair, the walls, the floor. It was wet and crusty. My first immediate thought was to get off the next stop and go into the adjacent car. I did just that. What surprised me was that nobody else did.
That's pretty wild. Can't believe no one else got off. Must have been such a strong smell if you were gagging. It's strange how people can just ignore stuff like that. I guess everyone just wanted to get home. Public transport can be a real mixed bag, especially during rush hour. Just goes to show you always have to be ready for anything. Shame it happened to you though.
/ a homeless dude setting up a literal camp inside a car of a subway train. Tent, sleeping bag, hot plate, the whole package. NYC ex-subway rider here. I've seen someone take a shit in the middle of the train car. Piss in the car. Many people puking. Rats the size of small cats running wild. People fucking. People masturbating. A rap music video being filmed. Countless preachers. Fights. A marriage proposal. Probably a lot of other crazy shit. The subway is insane sometimes. Now I'm in the suburbs and drive everywhere LOL and #X200B.
It sounds like the subway experience can get pretty wild. A guy setting up camp is just another layer to the chaos. You've seen a lot of strange things. I can't imagine dealing with rats and all those other random events. Life in the suburbs must feel a lot calmer compared to that. But hey, it's all part of city life, I guess.
I used to take the same bus to school and back every day for 5 years. It was a specialty bus with a weird path that only a few people would take, and I definitely knew where everyone got on and off. Sometimes if someone was asleep or not paying attention, I'd pull the string to request their stop and wake them, but even if I didn't, the driver would stop unrequested and ask if we're going somewhere else because he knew our stops too. If it makes your wife feel any better, it's just us remembering a routine, and it's not like there's much else to do sitting there for 45 minutes every day.
That's an interesting take on daily commuting. It's kind of funny how you get to know everyone and their patterns over time. The driver seems pretty considerate too, keeping tabs on the regulars. It sounds like a pretty chill routine, just passing the time on the bus. I guess it's those little interactions that make the journey feel a bit more familiar.
I used to work at a liquor store, and there were certain customers that as soon as their car pulled into the lot or I saw them coming down the sidewalk, I would go get their order and put it on the counter. One old man was actually a little offended by it and said, "You know, it's not just for me, right?" And he wasn't a complete alcoholic, it's just he always bought a 30-pack of beer, and he was so old and frail that he always had me carry it. I also didn't have the heart to tell him that I lived in a glass house and there's no way I was chucking stones.
That sounds like an interesting experience at the liquor store. It's kind of you to help out the customers, especially the old man. People have their habits, and it can be tricky to navigate those interactions. It's good you recognized your own situation, too. You probably saw a bit of yourself in him, which makes it all relatable. Sometimes, life puts you in positions where you just have to go along.
Because the crazy woman was acting crazy and was walking through the crowded train expecting people to give her 3 feet of personal space. The crazy lady just started berating this innocent woman trying to get home from work. People were trying to protect her and she was in total shock that her quiet commute was all of a sudden spiraling down. Then the crazy lady starts making a run for it, proclaiming, "They're calling the cops on me," and they let her out, where she was stopped by the train inspector and pushed him against a wall, and they wrestled until the cops came a few minutes later.
That was quite the train ride. Just some random person causing chaos, while others tried to keep the peace. The poor woman really just wanted to get home. It's frustrating how some people can turn a normal day into a mess. When the crazy lady ran off, you could tell she knew it was bad. The inspector probably didn't expect that either. Not a typical evening commute for anyone involved.
Oh yes, I do. Just as you will. Don't listen to people who want to play that "it's not like it used to be" tired trope. Of course it's different. NYC is a living, breathing entity, and is surprisingly malleable. Read up on the history. Time and Again by Jack Finney for fiction, A Drinking Life by Pete Hamill for empirical history, and The Power Broker by Robert Caro are good starts. To me, it's the most American city. Have fun, make memories, and fall in love as many times as possible. Remember, someday somebody is going to really want to hear about the late teens in NYC. These are the good old days.
The message feels pretty nostalgic about NYC. It highlights how the city is always changing and encourages embracing those changes. The book recommendations give a nice blend of fiction and history, which could be useful for anyone wanting to understand the city's depths. Overall, it's about making the most of the experience and creating lasting memories in a place that's constantly evolving.
It's fairly easy. First off, for Korea, you need to be from one of 7 countries: Canada, America, Australia, UK, South Africa, New Zealand, Ireland. Now you need a 4 degree, doesn't matter which country. Next you need to have a clean criminal background check, then you find a recruiter. Process is different based on the country, some countries have more requirements than others. You guys talk, you interview, blah blah. They make an offer, you accept, be prepared to pass a drug test, so stop smoking weed like 30 to 45 days out. They will pay for your flight, housing, accommodations. You'll work 5 days a week, 7 to 9 hours a day teaching English to Koreans. You will earn somewhere around $2,100 a month, about $1,900. The longer you stay, the more you make. Most top at around 2.5 or so. Going with EPIK is better than Hagwons, since EPIK is backed by the government and it's a safer bet. A lot of Hagwons go under and you end up shit creek without a paddle. But totally not a scam.
This looks like a straightforward overview of teaching English in Korea. Getting hired involves checking a few boxes like nationality, degree, and a clean record. The recruiter part seems standard, and they cover some expenses. Epic sounds more reliable compared to Hagwons, which can be risky. Overall, seems like a decent opportunity if you're interested in teaching abroad.
I lived in a small town in rural Japan back in the 1980s. Everyone in town knew little things about me, like what I liked to eat and where I had gone on vacation. People I had never met would ask me, "How was Okinawa?" Or, "So, you really like tonkatsu, huh?" At first I was freaked, then I realized that it kind of made sense. I was quite unusual. No big deal. If a huge purple guy showed up in your neighborhood, you would certainly know a few things about him, even if you weren't acquainted. It's just human nature.
It's interesting how small towns create a tight-knit community where everyone knows each other's business. That kind of familiarity can feel weird at first, but it also shows how connected people can be. The comparison to a huge purple guy makes sense, Something out of the ordinary draws attention. In a way, being unusual in such a place makes you more memorable.
Okay. Opened up an elevator to go to the platform, and there was a guy sitting cross-legged, facing the wall, waving a stick up and down while humming, with loads of clothes and multiple wallets sitting around him. We took the stairs, finished clearing the platform, and I wanted to see if he was still in there, after about an hour and a half. This was at 1 a.m. Opened the elevator, he's still there, but now he stood up facing me, waving his stick. His face was right up against the doors. They opened, he was staring at me dead in the eyes, humming, waving his stick, but now all the wallets and clothes were gone. So I said, "Oh, you're still busy in here," and we left.
That's a pretty weird encounter. I mean, a guy in an elevator at 1 a.m. doing that is something else. His behavior is definitely unsettling, especially when he turned to face you. It's good you just decided to leave instead of getting too involved. Better safe than sorry. It's the kind of story that sticks with you, though. Not every day you see something like that.
The blue line is the nicest, though admittedly the one I know least about. Everyone always argues about whether the red or orange line is better because the red is faster with less stops but does get delayed more frequently than the orange line. The orange line has way more stops, so it takes longer to go the same distance, and in general I always feel a bit more sketched out on the orange line. In my personal opinion, the green line is the worst because it's the slowest, breaks the most frequently, and has an absurd amount of unnecessary stops. It's also the one most likely to be way overcrowded and will take you the longest for your specific line to show up, only for it to be a two-car train with way too many people in it.
I get how the lines can be a topic of debate. Each one has its quirks. The blue line seems fine if you want a smoother ride. Red might be faster, but the delays are annoying. The orange line feels off with all those stops. And yeah, the green line sounds frustrating with overcrowding and long waits. Everyone has their preferences, I guess.
That is definitely more than a living wage in Korea, even in Seoul proper. You are pretty far off in your assumptions about developed Asian places. Hong Kong is very expensive. Singapore and parts of Japan are about on par with smaller to mid-sized cities in the USA. Most everywhere else is significantly cheaper in terms of cost of living. Even major cities like Shanghai, especially if you don't fall victim to blowing money on the nightlife, are really affordable by comparison. Source: taught English in Asia for several years.
The cost of living varies a lot in Asia. Places like Hong Kong and Singapore can be pricey. Cities in Japan can be similar to mid-sized US cities. Other locations like Shanghai offer more affordable options, especially if you avoid nightlife expenses. It's interesting how perceptions don't always match reality when it comes to costs in developed regions. That experience of teaching in Asia seems to give a clearer view.
For one, in this case it includes housing, which is at least 30% of your monthly expenses. So add 30% to that monthly income. For another, they aren't necessarily more expensive, and it depends on where you go. Tokyo is an expensive city, but other major cities in Japan aren't nearly as insane, and the cost of living isn't terrible. You can get an apartment in some of the major Japanese cities for about $600 a month, which is cheaper than any place I have ever lived in outside of my college dorm. Healthcare is also, like in most places in the world, ridiculously more affordable than it would be in the US. Considering healthcare is another high-cost item for Americans, have it be cheap also helps reduce the need for a high salary. You won't be making the big bucks like in America, but you are also likely to need less money for an equivalent quality of life. I think a reason people fail to realize this/think Asia is expensive, is based on them going there on vacation, when you are quite likely not going to the supermarket and making home-cooked meals, but staying at hotels and eating out 2 or 3 times a day.
The cost of living in Japan seems manageable compared to the US. Housing can be reasonable, especially in some cities. Healthcare is cheaper too, which is a big plus. The perception of Asia being expensive often comes from travelers who eat out a lot and stay in hotels. Living there could mean having a good quality of life without needing a huge salary. Overall, it's an interesting perspective.
Currently teaching at a Chinese university. It's honestly a pretty sweet deal, and you don't even get the best pay at public universities. Between free housing and cheap food, though, I'm saving over half my paycheck every month. I don't think I'll stay here forever. I'm not in love with the place the way I was in love with Japan while I lived there, but things are pretty good. By the way, I'm transferring to Shanghai next semester, so I'll be there this summer as well. The one big thing I recommend is to get hired directly by a school, if possible, and not by a middleman recruiter. The school has kept strictly to the contract they sent me while I was still in the US. Some recruiters play bait and switch, and it can get nasty.
Sounds like you're managing well in China. Free housing and cheap food can definitely help with saving money. Shanghai should be an interesting change. It has a vibrant culture. It's good that you found a decent deal with the school directly. Avoiding middlemen seems smart, especially if they can complicate things. Hope the next semester goes smoothly for you.